Crisis and Hope is being recorded. But besides that, is a project of the Rabbi Arthur Schneier Program in International Affairs and the Center for Israel Studies. Crisis and Hope is a forum for conversation on important issues and themes in the life of Yeshiva University and of the world. I'm Stephen Fine. I'm the Horgan Professor of Jewish History and Director of the Center for Israel Studies. And I'm so happy tonight to welcome you to our program, Civility, Citizenship, and Torah. Our speakers are the eminent Professor Suzanne Last-Stone, University Professor of Jewish Law and Contemporary Civilization, Professor of Law and Director of the Center for Jewish Law and Contemporary Civilization, and of the Israel Supreme Court Translation Project, all at the YU Cardoso Law School. Shalom Carmy, the beloved Shalom Carmy, teaches philosophy and Jewish studies at Yeshiva University. He is the editor emeritus of the flagship journal of modern Orthodoxy tradition and writes a monthly column called, and I like the title, Litvak at Large, in a journal called First Things. Now, our purpose tonight is to talk about civility at a time in our cultural lives when civility is a good thing in American culture. You know, we have been in many countries over our 3,000-year existence as the Jewish people. But this is the first one where we were in a country and we were actually owners and not vassals and not visitors and not people who were tolerated. We're actual owners of this bite. And so as owners, it's caused great discussion. There's a wonderful dissertation that turned into a book by a scholar in Los Angeles who dealt with the question of Dina de Malchuta Dina. The law of the land is the law. And the transition beginning with the French Revolution of Jewish law from being the law of the foreigner to being the law of a citizen. And what does it mean to be a citizen within a body, to be the Balei Habayit? And so tonight's conversation is about what it means for us, not as a tolerated group, not as a group that is somehow not integral to the system, but to the Jewish people as integrated and woven in and part of, and no different in that way than any other citizenship group, an amazing phenomenon in the history of the Jews. And we have two people here to do it who are astonishingly capable of thinking about these questions of civility and citizenship through that lens of Torah that gives meaning to all of our lives. And so I welcome Shalom and I welcome Suzanne. And here we are to start. Please, who wants to begin?
Oh, thank you. I'm going to allow Shalom to frame the first question. He and I have a long history of talking together, which I love and appreciate. Shalom, what should we talk about?
Well, you know the points that I wrote down. And
So go.
I think one question that people ask very often, are we really in a period of extraordinary incivility in our political and social life? I think we're in agreement that compared to the 19th century, it's not really that bad.
I totally agree.
In the one-sidedness, the fact that people read only the newspapers of their own group. You go back to Martin Van Buren and what was written about him. You go back to all these people. There was much less balance than there might be today.
I'm in complete agreement with you, Shalom. And I would say it's funny because I remember I had a brief stint as an op-ed writer on the side, very much on the side. And I remember writing a piece, it must be almost 10 years ago, and it was about the civility crisis. And I was quoting all of these experts, and that was, 10 years ago. And nothing has really changed. But I think, we are in agreement that it ebbs and flows, right? Civility and incivility in the history of the United States, right, is ebbs and flows. This is something, it's a familiar pattern. And maybe what we can identify is when it tends to be more uncivil and when we go back to these civility crises. Right, I think that there's a common factor that tends to happen, which is that when people are really debating core issues, right? There's disagreement about core values, core questions of the identity, what it means to be an American. That's when there's a civility crisis. And people are very polite when what they're talking about really is having a common goal, but having a disagreement about how to get there. Right? So that's a kind of roller coaster that American history has generally followed. Shalom, you agree with me about that?
Largely, yes. I would want to indicate 4 factors that overlap that may be important for us to think about. One is what political scientists call the partisan sort. And once upon a time, you were a Democrat, you were a Republican. That didn't determine your position on every specific issue. Today, there's much more homogeneity for reasons we may want to go into or not. If you hold like a Republican, so to speak, about foreign policy, you have to hold the same position on abortion. You have to hold the same positions in economics, and vice versa. Usually they'll say, well, once upon a time, there were Southern Democrats who made the Democratic Party more broad. There were things called liberal Republicans. Now there's much greater lockstep. Secondly, there's an emphasis on identity politics. What you hold on politics is not your view, it's about your identity. Political affiliations, like religious commitments, determine not what you hold, but who you are. And that makes it very difficult to raise questions without insulting the other person, without making that person feel that they have to become exactly like you, which they don't want to do. Thirdly, I think the differences are fundamental today, what you call core values. And it's difficult for people to deal with. In a rationalistic culture, which our educational system is, the sense is that everybody can start from the same position, and if they reason properly and have their facts straight, they will reach the same conclusions. That's not the way the real world is. In the real world, people operate from strongly different intuitions of what the world is all about, and to sort these things out requires a lot of patience and a lot of willingness to realize that you're not going to convince the other person unless that person has really become ripe for convincing. Lastly, the issues are important issues, they're momentous. The crises we face, and ecological issues, climate change, the whole social structure, are very important. If the government's going to intervene in these matters, then who controls the government and what ideology they follow changes everything. It's not an inconvenience. It actually changes your whole life. It changes the future drastically. So all of these things lead to a much greater emotional investment and a much greater difficulty in talking to other people, and perhaps even more than talking to people, listening to other people.
So I'm in large agreement with you, Shalom, although I actually think that what we denominate now as an identity politics issue has always been with us. And if we think about core issues, if we think about the times of great markers of great incivility in American political history, around the Civil War, around the New Deal, I'm not sure that these were different in kind from what we're facing. So other than that, I think I agree with you. But I would also mention something else that struck me. I mean, I think that in part, two things that struck me. One of which is that civility is actually, it's a kind of virtue that is about social life. Right? So when you think about the 18th century political philosophers or Scottish philosophers, civility is about sociality, right? It's about how you behave in some space that's called society. And I do think that one thing that we have as a tremendous stressor now is that we have less sociality. And obviously now with the virus, we have immensely less sociality. But because of virtual technologies, we've had less sociality for a while now. So I think there's something there that might be interesting to think about the way that civility is actually an ethical virtue that tends to be performed in a certain kind of social life that you don't get if you're getting your groceries delivered, for example. You're not going to the local shop and conversing with the person behind the counter all the time. You're not, I think there's something about that that's increasing the dilemma. And the second thought that occurred to me was also that, one of the things that we're fighting about so much, not one of the important issues that Shalom raised, but a kind of side issue that is very much a part of our culture wars, is about how we speak. So I think there's also the lack of civility as a kind of performance against various kinds of attempts to legislate civility. So I think there's something around this issue in particular that's actually become really heightened today.
One aspect of that is isolation, is being in a bubble, which you connected with the life of the internet, or the situation of kind of virtual social life, which is not a real social life. Part of it, again, uniformity. You only are in contact with people who think exactly like you. Part of it may be a consequence of freedom. You loosen restriction, you loosen inhibitions. If you look at the way people talk to each other on television in the 1970s, suddenly insult humor. If people say things very loudly and very insultingly, deliver lines, the canned laughter laughs, and you get the impression that's really the way people are supposed to talk. You look at 50s television, you can see that beginning, where the kids on television have chutzpah to the parents once in a while. And if you go on Google, go on YouTube, you can see that beginning. And as you're more desperate to excite the television watcher or whoever it is who's the audience, you become more and more extreme. And yelling becomes is a substitute for arguing or reasoning.
Oh, I'm less persuaded by that, Sheldon. I think insult humor, you and I are mostly in agreement about so many things, but on this, I'm not sure. I think that insult humor, when you said it, the image I had actually is insult humor in the Bavli. There's insult humor. People who are intimate with one another, right, or at least have some kind of shared discourse. This is a very accepted form of humor. And I'm not sure there's something wrong with that.
And sometimes you wonder, you look at the exchange of letters in the Balamar, and I forgot who,
Or
and David.
introductions to most of the Rambam's.
And you really wonder about something that's going on there. And sometimes the students are troubled by it.
Yeah. So I'm not sure I'm troubled by it. I think that somehow
But these are elites writing
framed, and I think it's framed in a situation in which people took it to be, at least in terms of comedy now, people took it to be either loving or didactic. Right? That the insult humor was either didactic. In the Bavli, it's often didactic, right? And certainly I think in the Rambam, it's didactic, or it's to fend off something that he's really worried about. But I think in comedy, insult humor was intended to be a kind of way of including people. So I'm not sure about that, but we'll have to consult.
Being a way of putting the kids on the same level as the adults.
Yeah.
Father does not know best. The kids know better.
Yes.
Or at least the kids can shut the father up.
I'm not advocating.
Yeah.
Definitely not, as a grandmother. So I know that one of the things we said that we would talk about that I think is also equally important is the question of how civility in particular relates to American culture, and therefore also our role as American citizens. And I think that's for one thing, civility and the word citizen sound alike, and they sound alike for a reason. Right? Civility is understood to be a certain kind of form of discourse, right? An ethical way of speaking related to public speaking, right? Not about family discourse, right? It's not describing, it's not really the word that we use to describe how people in small communities or tribes or close families speak to one another. We use it distinctly to describe, right, a kind of discourse of citizens in the public sphere. That public sphere might be the coffee house, or it might be the internet, right? But it's in the public sphere. So it's distinctly related to the democratic goals that we have. And I think we have to understand it as such. Shalom, do you agree that we should think about it in those terms, in these specific?
The question that occurs to me now is, do we really keep that border between the private sphere and the public sphere as separate as we sometimes think we do? Has it been a blurring of lines? People speak in public, they would speak in private. Hannah Arendt, when we discussed in different contexts a few weeks ago, had that very sharp and almost unrealistic, straight out unrealistic conception of how the public sphere has its rules and the social sphere, which she meant the family, and is a completely different realm. And the tragedy of the French Revolution and Communist Revolution is that they mixed the two together, and the founding fathers in the United States avoided that. This question, should we equate those standards? And should we say, in the name of greater relaxation, speak in public the way we would in private? Or is it a tragedy if we do so? And is it harmful if we do so?
So I think those distinctions are important. I'm more Rendian maybe than you are. I think the difference between public speech and private, if I think about it, if I said that a husband and a wife spoke very civilly to one another, I don't know that it would be taken as a compliment. I'm not sure that that's what we mean by civility.
It means they disagree very strongly and they don't show it in front of the kids. They're careful enough not to do something irrevocable.
So
that's
you're
in the public realm as well.
Hmm?
In the public realm as well, you can have politicians who are opposing each other, they realize that at the end of the day, they may have to work with each other in the future, and they may even go to and have a drink together.
But you know, they do that even if they insult one another.
Yeah, they do
Right,
one
so-
thing on the congressional record, and then they're able to talk to each other. Partly because they know they may be educated that way, and partly because they know the alliances may change tomorrow. In a family, you usually don't get rid of your family because you have a political disagreement with them, or even a sharper disagreement. Would one say that our political life would be healthier if people observed that distinction more carefully and realize the people we're arguing with are people that are who are fellow citizens? You cannot govern if you win the election if 47% of the people are against you and you can't overcome. And you can't really work with people if you're going to kick them out of the polity, if you reduce them to rubble. Does that mean, and you cannot pretend that just because you're in charge or they're in charge, that you agree with them. Again, it's a harder thing to do in the political realm once you've lost it than in a family realm.
So in the
this
family
case, you get a divorce, you move out.
Yeah, there is something, I guess I want to preserve this idea that civility and being civil is still an arm's length relationship. And that's why I don't associate it with the family. I think that I think I want to preserve that because I don't want civility to be collapsed with other ethical virtues of treating people with
Politeness.
respect.
You would distinguish between civility and politeness.
Yeah, I think civility is part of politeness, but I think it's also related. It's not just politeness, it's related to political speech, and it's related to how you debate about the common good of citizens in the shared space that they have. So for me, civility has this very particular political connotation, and it's particularly connected for me with democratic culture. Right. So if you don't remember civil society, what do we mean by that? Well, of course, we have many, many definitions of what civil society is. But one of the connotations is that we have this space, right, in between the family and government that we are actually filling with some kind of political discourse. And civility, that's the realm of citizens and civility for me. And I think that's, and I think in a democracy, I think it's peculiarly important in a democracy. You know, one of the conversations is in, this may be a side conversation, but the truth is that democracies probably more than any other form have a propensity to violence. Usually people talk about, you know, ballots, not bullets, but I don't think that that's true. There's a wonderful article by David Rappaport of UCLA about this. And of course, our founding fathers didn't think it was true because the framers of the Constitution, at least, spend an enormous amount of time trying to figure out what to do as an antidote to competition, conflict, factionalism. That's the core guts of the Federalist Papers. That's one aspect of democracy, but I think the other aspect of democracy that can lead to violence more than other structures, including authoritarian structures, is that democracy has a tendency to promote perfectionist thinking because it really is a wonderful form. And so we have a lot of hope for it. And since we have hope for it, we think that we can perfect it and make it perfect. And when that doesn't happen, that sometimes leads to violence. Dashed hope is one of the worst things in politics. So I think that civility is a peculiarly important quality as an antidote to these tendencies in democracy.
Somebody raised a hand, so I don't know who's going to recognize him. Elon.
Hi, how are you?
I'm not sharing the meeting, but.
So I just want to ask a question on, I don't know what to call you, Suzanne, Mrs. Stone, Miss Stone, whatever you.
Miss Suzanne. I teach a lot. I teach in Israel a lot, so mostly my students call me Suzanne.
Okay, got it. Okay, so Suzanne, so I believe you just said that aspects of democracy that can lead to violence, such as perfectionist thinking, right? More so than, possibly more so than authoritarian governments, right? I believe that's what you just said. What about, can't you say, so then you said civility is an important quality in making sure that that doesn't happen. What about bills that force civility upon people, such as, in Canada, Bill C-16, which basically legislates not using gender pronouns as hate speech, right? And they basically,
Right.
so do you see that as an ominous sign that maybe these aspects of civility can lead to democracy devolving into authoritarianism? That is the authoritarianism that's very similar to the Marxist.
I wouldn't say that I see, hate speech regulation, for example, as devolving into authoritarianism. That's too far, too fast. But I do think it raises a very, very interesting question about legislating what are ethical virtues. And I think that's a really interesting question. And it's a really interesting question, actually, as a big picture concept. It's a really interesting question in general about ethics, right? Of whether it can be legislated. And it's an interesting thing to think about in light of Jewish tradition and rabbinic thought, right? Can we legislate ethics? And so I do think that there is something there that is very well worth parsing about, thinking about. But let's not slide immediately. That seems to be illustrating a little bit what Shalom had to say before about the problems of taking things to extremes when we begin to think about, right, a hate speech code as if that were authoritarianism of the sort that is juxtaposed to a democratic system, right? That's a huge leap. So what we want is a little bit, so I think that there's another aspect of civility that we're talking about that presents itself here, which is a certain bit of balance and moderation, right? Not immediately going to the immense extreme.
I think the two issues. One is the extremeness that Suzanne spoke about. You don't know where to stop. The other is that I don't know that such legislation will actually work, because people will, what you don't let people say publicly, they'll whisper.
Mm-hmm.
And the resentment may boil up even more.
I thought I would raise one more question, Shalom, because we built this as civility, citizenship, and Torah. So I think we have to have a Torah ending of some kind, besides references to insults in the Bible. But I wondered whether we might discuss a little bit, since we have been discussing the idea of a public sphere and civility being important in a public sphere. So it occurred to me that trying to think through where we might see some kind of parallels of discussion about things like the Beit Medrash and the Farhesia. I think, right, there are different kinds of conceptual spaces that we have and occupy. And can we think of those in terms of styles also of discussion? There's definitely very different modes of communication that you're supposed to do in the Farhesia and that you do in the Beit Midrash. And it might be interesting to think through those kinds of things, because they might teach us something about styles of expression and styles of communication and what belongs where. So I'll open that up a little bit for us to maybe talk about in our remaining 4 minutes, or for you to think about. I'll just add here one thing that's kind of interesting. Farhesia, of course, is a Greek word, right? That comes from and basically means frank speech. And it's referring to the Greek ideal, right? Hannah Arendt speaks about this a lot, the Greek ideal of speaking the truth, and a harsh truth, as a citizen, your duty as a citizen in public debate. And it's really quite interesting because I don't think that's actually the way in which it's parsed in rabbinic sources. It's somewhat different, right? It's not about frankness. It's about something entirely different. In that way, the Greek idea behind the word is much more in the Beit Medrash than it is in what you can do in the Farhesia, which is supposed to be a place of showing a certain respect, dignity, right, and honor. So we might play with that. I think it's a fun thing to think about.
I would want to make a distinction in two aspects of civility as virtue. One is, what does it make us? Who do I want to be? Do I want to be the kind of person who runs around being abusive or dishonest in my argumentation and so forth? And I may not want to be that kind of person in terms of my own self-perfection. And another aspect of being aware of how I affect other people. And again, if I know that these people disagree with me, I should be thinking about how they're going to respond to what I say, how they're going to react to what I say. And if I speak in a certain manner, I'm not making converts. I may fire up my base, but it may become much more difficult to convince the other side. And certainly, even to continue to work with them. There's an anger that can be destructive of relationships, an abusiveness that can prevent people from ever working together or being civil to each other in the future. There's another kind of anger, which is more garden variety, where people are not so much angry, as irritable, impatient. It can be abusive, but it's not what Samuel Johnson calls gigantic anger, a gigantic and enormous species of anger, but rather everyday anger where a person in the end will only succeed in making people avoid him or her, or will make you ridiculous. If part of the purpose of political discourse is to get people to agree with you or to tolerate you at the very least, and that's important for us, you can't have society without some degree of toleration, without some degree of working together. I say particularly for us who are a small minority and not always appreciated as much as we would like to be, for bad reasons and sometimes for good reasons. If we cannot maintain a certain level of discourse, and if people either view us as obnoxious or as bullying or as just ridiculous, the guy explodes, he foams over, and you laugh at him afterwards, then we are destroying our social fabric. And we're also really pragmatically making it a lot more difficult for us to get what we want. If what we want is that things should go our way, or at least when they don't go our way, that we should have a space where we can continue to live.
So I would rephrase what you said, Shalom. I agree with you entirely. And I would rephrase it as a community, we need a little more Farhesia and a little less Beit Medrash. Meaning that in the Farhesia, you need to be self-conscious about how you're acting in a way that exposes a group and impugns God's honor, in a sense, right? Which is more important than speaking truth.
And if we're in a very
and that's important.
Yeah.
So
if we are in a very homogeneous subculture, we might not even realize, it doesn't register on us that these other people are not judging us the way our friends judge us. It's dangerous for us and for them.
Yes.
All right, Stephen.
You know,
I
the
see you're
Jerusalem
ready.
Talmud, only to open the conversation.
Add that to
But,
my
you know,
mouth.
the Jerusalem Talmud describes an awful scene where the house of Hillel and the Beit Shammai are in one of the upper story rooms in the temple. And they're arguing and they're arguing, and they argue most of the time pretty well. Except in this case, over 18 specific things, of which we have 3 lists of those 18 things, right? Beit Shammai wins, which is pretty unusual. And the Talmud Yerushalmi says that the reason they won was essentially they walked into the Beit Midrash with a bunch of baseball bats and beat up the Beit Hillel people until they could stand there and vote and get their way in minutiae of halakha. 6 centuries later, something else happened. A document was found in the Cairo Geniza in recent times and published that describes a fast that took place in Eretz Israel every single year at the end of the Talmudic period, where Jews worked actively to repent the behavior of Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai that led to that awful desecration in the temple. In our world, and I think you guys will agree because we seem to be living in the same sort of place, the temple is this cultural sphere, the parhesia, as Suzanne said, in which we all live. Let's not get to the place where 6 centuries from now, we have to regret and repent the way we behaved this year or any other year. And that, for me, has to be the goal. And I'd like to open up to all of you folks who've joined us to join the conversation. Anyone?
Judy had some questions. She wrote it in the chat.
Let me get to the chat.
Yeah.
It didn't come to mind, Ronnie.
Okay. So I'll read them. Okay. She wants to know more about the relationship between speech and actions like violence. I know that's touched on, and Steve, you just brought in an ancient instance of violence. But if you guys want to talk a little bit more about that, and that, I mean, I think you guys from the beginning, both of you spoke about the violent nature of society and how ideas and passions spill over, and that's actually much more normal than we think. Our fears of erupting in civil war or minor forms of civil unrest are in a continuum, right? Is what you kind of said. But if you guys can talk a little bit more about that, I think that would be wonderful. Thank you.
You want to go first?
Violence is a real thing, and it is a fact of life. And Stephen mentioned, right, the evidence that we have, both from the Geniza and from statements in the Talmud, right? Rabbi Eliezer, the famous Rabbi Eliezer of the, right, of Panur Shalachinai, right? With Tosefta relates, he came armed, right? He came with all his armor. So, right, there were battles, and those are, and so violence is a fact of life. And the notion that, right, we ought not to lotus go to do, we should not break into sects, right, comes from experience, not from just a utopian ideal. So I think that we have to accept, obviously, the fact that democratic forms of political life will have violent eruptions in them, from small violence to larger, from civil disobedience to real protests to secessionary movements, etc. That's a fact of life, but we can do our best to try to prevent it happening on our watch. And I was suggesting that civility is one of the major ways of preventing it. That is.
Can I ask?
Whoa.
Can I add? Yes. Can I add something to that in the element? But what when it's l'shem shamayim, right? When it's free, you believe in your cause, right? It's not like you're okay, I'm okay. No, this is as Rabbi Carmy said earlier. You know, these are big issues. They're going to affect my life, my children's life, my family, my community. It's hard to stand by. And this doesn't matter what position you're taking. I'm just saying the l'shem, once you have a l'shem shamayim sense that this has to, you know, this is important. This is the truth. And the other side is endangering that. You know, how civility is civility enough, right? And this, I guess, and I'll add this one last thing. You know, this idea that Hannah Arendt was saying about part of being a citizen in the public sphere is speaking truth, those hard truths. How do you navigate that? And how do we avoid spilling over to something where it becomes Chilul Hashem, right? Where it becomes this great desecration that, like we were saying, we want to avoid. Even though we know l'shem shamayim, we feel one way or the other, right?
Two small thoughts about it, and I'm sure Shalom has more developed ones. My two small thoughts are, I think it's the height of hubris to think that one's political views are for the Shema. I mean, I think there's something wrong with that. I agree, but in the sense of Lishma, in its real sense, right? For the sake of heaven. I mean, how do you know, right? That you believe in it passionately, I understand. That you really, truly believe this is correct and you want this, yes. But to talk about it as if it's truly, right, an argument Lishma, seems to me from a religious perspective to be a little bit problematic. To equate politics and religion in this very, very clear way. I mean, I think that's something that deserves thought. Right, so that's one thing I wanted to just throw out there.
Couple points here. One,
had a course on religion and violence. I feel I can kind of chime in here.
Right.
I think one question is, do you view violence in general as legitimate or not? In 1858, I believe, a Southern congressman approached Senator Sumner of Massachusetts and beat him over the head with a cane. The beating ended or approached the end when the cane broke. He kept on going, but it was basically over at that point, and Sumner was crippled for several years. I don't think this made the South more popular. The point is that congressman, his name was Brooks from South Carolina, he was brought up, he believed, not that he was doing with l'shem shamayim, it was l'shem himself, but he believed that defending your honor is the kind of thing that you ought to do. So that's an ethical proposition, which is questionable. It has nothing to do with a religious level. It has to do with a certain kind of idea of nobility. And that's something we really don't want. Second, the point Suzanne made, do we make politics more important than it really is? It's really more central to our identity than it ought to be. We start out saying it is because of all the factors I mentioned at the beginning. But for a religious person is, in general, leaving aside just extreme situations, should we invest our souls so heavily in political matters? Is it really, really, really that important? Now, if you have nothing else going on in your life, if you don't have a religious life, you don't have this, you don't have that. So what's left is getting heated up on the internet and acting verbally in that. Thirdly, there is a role in religious life and ethical life for self-examination. Now, you'll tell me the kind of people who are violent are not the kind of people who are very good at self-examination. But it is something that we want to train people for. It should be part of our ethical training and our intellectual training. Last point, which I think may be relevant to everybody here. When individuals become violent, we cannot simply say, well, they acted as individuals. To some degree, the people in the middle create the atmosphere where the really violent people feel validated. All these religious Zionists had no intention of assassinating Rabin. But if you start talking about it and the people around you, they want to be polite, or they think, yeah, you're right, but really, 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 did you ask the Gdolim? Did Shlomo Zalman tell you to do it? You're sort of rejecting violence the way the proverbial shul board wished the rabbi a speedy recovery by a vote of 7-5. You're sending a message. Hannah Arendt, whom we mentioned before, makes that point very heavily in her Origins of Totalitarianism, in terms of what makes Nazis or communists operate. Nazis did not want everybody to be a member of the party because they wanted to have a periphery of people who buffered between the real fanatics and the opposition to them. And that's something that I think is all of us at some point or another may have responsibility for.
In what sense?
You're a shul rabbi, people speak in a certain way, and you say that's not the way we should be speaking. You're not a shul rabbi, you can say the same thing. I'm sorry, I don't want to speak that way. In the old days, and I was critical of that in the old days, in a social gathering, you could never talk about politics and religion. And at the time I said, well, what else should we be talking about? What else is there? What's worth talking about? And start talking about, in those days, who's better, Mays or Mantle? It can also end up destroying friendships. But I wonder whether in our circumstances today, we have fewer inhibitions about these things, whether we should go back to saying, you get together with the relatives you can't stand on Thanksgiving, then you really should play certain things off limits.
I think
Discussions are only 4 times when people are ripe for them and people are capable of doing them. I'm sorry I interrupted you.
No, I was interrupting you, Shalom, but I think your point about placing certain conversations off limits is an interesting one in particular, because I think one of the things we have a hard time with now is coming up with topics of conversation beyond politics. And it has to do in some way with a certain diminution in topics, right, that make for conversation among people, whether it's about literature or friendship or something else. There seems to be something that a little bit of the world has shrunk. And I love that idea of leaving it off the table in order to increase our capacity to talk about more things. I think has been somewhat difficult of late.
We lived in Israel through the Rabin crisis and through the intifadas, and it became the point where politics was just not something to be discussed on Shabbat because no one in the shul would be able to talk to anybody else in the shul. And it was serious business, this issue, because the accusations were so strong. It's almost like what I'm feeling today. the accusations, the contempt. Within many communities, attempts by one side of a community to convince the other of its political has blown up, which because seeming breaking down of that shul decorum rule of not discussing politics, and there are shuls that are breaking in too, and you can feel it from community to community. And so the lo go to do business, lo tasu agudot agudot, is even stronger. Remember, lo go to do originally was about do not make cuts in yourself, and we're literally making cuts in our communal fabric through this process. And have to have rules. If we don't have rules, we're going to break into smaller and smaller and smaller groups that we are willing to talk to.
I once heard from Rav Amital, somebody came to see him and they argued with him for hours about his political position. And finally, he said to the man, he said, it made sense when I was a little bit involved in politics. You would argue, you'd think it's important to get me on your side or at least to neutralize me. But now I have no connection with anything. Why is it so important for you whether one more person agrees with your politics or does not agree with your politics? Why is it so important for you? I would say this in a different way about religion as well, even though religion really, really, really is important. But if you know that you're not going to convince somebody, you're not going to have a knockdown argument, at the end of that argument, the person puts on tefillin or becomes a Chabad Chassid or becomes a Reform rabbi. If you have a sense of proportion, you realize that you cannot set up these conversations or these harangues as a make it or break it business where you're going to camp out, as General Grant once put it, in fact, to camp out all summer. I'm going to win this battle. You wonder, why do people feel so invested? And some people can ask themselves, why is it so necessary to engage in that? And really, what would people talk about? I thought, if there was no Trump anymore, what would people talk about?
We could try.
It's a challenge. I have.
It is a challenge. It's because he's filled up the air so much.
Politics. And, sometimes I have to run before dinner. I have to run to academia.edu and start searching for topics. But it's a great thing. Right? I've got homework. I have to think about philosophical questions, literary questions. It's a good thing.
But I think part of the issue is, and this I want to there's a few questions. There's some great questions in the chat, and I want to try to address some of them. Is that on some level today it feels like so many things have become politicized, right? Whether you wear a mask, whether you think there's climate change, whether you think where these used to be areas of science and different opinions, and you figure it out, and what do you apply? And then now it's this becomes tribal. So obviously our religion ends up getting swept into this, and the way and so that's kind of the question I'm sensing from some of the questions here is there a way that religion, is there a way that I think, can religion not have something to say about the political decisions we're making? Is there a way to separate it? Is that a good thing? Is that a kind of an abandonment of the power of religion to affect our lives? So I'm going to leave that to you guys. But I think that's a question that I'm sensing here. I think the people's Jewishness and their political engagement, how does that, play out? One thing is figuring out how to be a mensch with the people in your shul or in your family or whatever it is. Another thing is, how how do I navigate those two elements that are so important to my life? And all right, I'll leave that to you.
Rodney,
One
let me add something. It's not just your
self-examination,
life.
which I mentioned
sorry.
before. One question is, again, how important, even though these political decisions are important, how overwhelming are they? Put it in proportion. And again, I may be betraying my own view, but even if I don't believe that the masks are such a wonderful panacea, should I cause anxiety to the people who do believe in it just because I don't feel that way? Question proportion. The other question is rationality. Rather than quote halacha, I will quote Isha halacha. There is a conversation that I had that is recorded in Jeffrey Gurak's book on Yeshiva University. In those days, I was against the war in Vietnam, more or less. And I'm still, even though I may write for conservative magazines, but I still don't believe that war, as my mother used to say, it's easier to kriechen rein zum Blatt. It's easier to crawl into the mud than to get out of the mud. And she got it right on that. But the Rav was a hawk. I wrote something. The Rav came into the cafeteria, sat down, and delivered a discourse. And he said, if you believe as I do in the domino theory, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, then you should be pro-war. If you don't agree with that thesis, then you don't really have a good reason to be in favor of the war. And you may very well have an obligation to protest the war. You're a citizen. He didn't use the word citizen, but you have a responsibility. You're not a slave. And you should act on that. Now, that personal example says a great deal. The problem is, I don't know that everybody who has a megaphone and knows how to shout through the megaphone necessarily will say the same things that the Rav would have said.
So I react to the question you posed, Ronnie, a little differently, not because I disagree, but because I interpreted the question differently. And I think it touches on something that we can't spend a lot of time on now, but I think is a really interesting question that has to do with a change in the way we see separate spheres of life, religion and politics. So it used to be, right? I mean, that liberalism was thought of as, I'll quote Michael Walzer, the art of differentiating spheres, that we knew that there were different kinds of spaces and places, and we didn't get that confused. Religion here, politics there, art over there. And one of the aspects of contemporary life is that those divisions are collapsing. And that's, I think, really increased a lot of the confusion. Right? So, for example, one thing we definitely see is that politics takes on the structure of religion. Now, it's always taken on a certain kind of structure of religion, but it's increasingly so. And we have the phenomenon of political religion, right? That is the contemporary phenomenon, right? Of trying to deliberately collapse these distinctions. I think this is a subject of a much bigger conversation to say something actually intelligent about that, but that's part of, I think, the problem that we have, that we have a confusion today about these being separate spheres?
I think there are two reasons
We've had a lot.
for confusion. One is legitimate, namely that these spheres really are related, but they're related in a very subtle way. So if you talk to intelligent people, their positions may not be predictable, may be very subtle. And if people are not subtle, they cannot handle that. The other reason is what I referred to earlier as partisan sorting, where people identify very much with a particular political identity, then you're a traitor. If you're a liberal on abortion and a hawk on foreign policy, or vice versa. And that forces people into a straitjacket. If you're a politician, it's because you're afraid of a primary challenge. For regular people, it may be that they just are swept in. They may not have thought through all the issues. Even people who pay attention to questions of climate change, I certainly am not in a position to give lectures on it, to tell you what should be done or what should not be done. There are a lot of people who know a lot less than I do, and then they react from the gut, or they react in terms of how they expect other people to expect them to react. Here, it may be that Rabbanim should be particularly circumspect. When a rabbi speaks from the pulpit and he starts fulminating about whoever doesn't agree with his political position, the Baal Habayit is not hearing this as one man speaking outside of his expertise, who may have some intelligent points and may have some stupid points, or no points at all. They're hearing this is what Judaism says. If you accept it, go right down the line. If you don't accept it, maybe go daven somewhere else or don't daven at all. I could give a lot of examples, but I'm not in a mood, and I hope that you're not in a mood either.
We had an interesting question.
Example.
We had an interesting question, which I guess has a temporary resonance. Somebody asked about the problem of the moderate middle behaving like the moderate middle, and the extremes on either side, it makes no difference, behaving like the immoderate opposition. And this person senses that the moderate middle is facilitating the extreme by being moderate, right? And so I'm wondering how we respond to that in any particular case, right? How do we respond to moderation being a form of facilitation rather than a form of moderateness, if you will? Any thoughts? That's a tough one.
Yeah, I think I'd need an example to make it concrete.
I know, me too. That's why I'm responding the way I am. But I guess the question is, when does moderate end, and when does moderate have to weaponize? And I think that whoever asked the question is asking a very contemporary question. After all, we've seen the Lincoln Project weaponizing the left when the left didn't do it that way before, right? And so there's all sorts of implications of this in any pre-post-war political campaign. We got used to civility, as you guys mentioned from the very beginning.
We need a path in the middle.
Do we have any more questions?
The example that I gave before about the way in which you create a buffer where the extremists say what they say, and you nod and mumble a little bit, and you're not willing to bang on a table. That's, I think, one problem. One issue in the political realm, again, is a primary challenge, all these options of defeating a politician who's not extreme enough. Let me quote somebody whom I think is absolutely wrong, but interestingly wrong. There's an Israeli artist named Yair Garbuz, very left-wing person. He said a lot of ethnic things about Sephardim, which got the left into trouble in Israel. But some years ago, he was at a symposium and he lashed out against moderates. He said, what do we have in Israel today? You've got a left-wing camp, you've got a right-wing camp. These people at least know what they believe. Then you've got moderates, and then the political scientists are telling you the moderates determine who's really going to rule. Whether it's 55-45 one way or 55-45 the other way. Who are these moderates? A moderate means a person who's looking at very important issues, make or break issues, and this person does not even have a strong commitment on one side or another.
But you know, a moderate.
10% of moderates are idiots. They should not be the people who determine anything.
Except that moderates could be occupying that space, Shalom, that you were talking about before, which is the notion that you have to buy into a whole set of ideas to pick right on one side or the other, that you can't be both pro-abortion and anti, right? Whatever the example was, right? And I don't associate moderation necessarily with being tepid about what you believe, but rather that you actually have a set of beliefs that come from, right? Some are from the right and some are from the left. And the moderation part is partly that you resist the program that you described before of being all in to only one set down the line.
Again, Garbuz is who he is. I'm quoting him. It's just a fun reference.
Mm-hmm.
And
Cool.
you won't
I'd like
invite
to
him.
ask.
Maybe you'll debate him.
Yep.
Cool. I'd like to ask if anybody would like to unmute and ask questions, comments. We're a pretty small group. There's no sense in doing this otherwise. Josh, go ahead.
Hi, thanks so much for that. Really, really interesting hour. I appreciate the conversation and your time. I guess my question was, and I think Steve was the one that was trying to be channeled to you, but maybe I didn't type it so clearly. There were times, Rabbi Carmy, that you were talking about telling people not to be so political, that whether they're wasting their time on Facebook or Twitter or in conversations at Kiddush or whatever, who are they going to convince they should get back to basics? It's that kind of thing. And other times you talked about how the moderates allow the violent actors to act. And it seems to me that's a stira, or potentially a stira, or lechora it's a stira, because it seems to me, and if you've, I don't know if you've read anything I've written, but I've written on this publicly that politics is religious, because not necessarily, the Torah doesn't necessarily speak to, should the highest tax bracket be 38% or 62%? I don't know if the Torah speaks to that. But surely the Torah speaks to a lot of things. And it seems to me that we have to, that being the moderates and not choosing is itself a choice that allows those in power to act. And in a very extreme time right now with our current government, but it could be a different time as well, I suppose. We often look back, I often say, back at the time of slavery, we praise rabbis who condemned slavery, and we sort of are disappointed that more rabbis didn't condemn slavery because it was political. And looking back, we praise rabbis who condemned Jim Crow and regret that more rabbis didn't condemn Jim Crow because they thought it was too political. But that's all, it doesn't help to do it in retrospect. You got to do it now when people are vulnerable and at risk and being threatened. And I'm wondering if you could speak to that stira at all, that I heard, and it could be that I misheard you, and that's certainly possible.
At a one-to-one level, it's possible to communicate disapproval vigorously without exploding, without putting it out of proportion. Now, if you tell me there are a lot of people who just won't get the hint, that's a problem. But educationally, part of what you want to educate people to is to get that hint. That's one issue that I think we have to work at. Again, the accusation was always made against people like the Rav or people like Rav Lichtenstein is that they were too subtle. And the result is whoever wanted to twist what they said around or ignore them was able to do it. The other question is not every political question should be dealt with as a make it or break it matter. And if every political issue becomes something like that, then you may be in trouble. You take, let's say, the question of how Jews should respond to Nazism in the 1930s. Well, if you start yelling and screaming, people will ignore you. But how do you deal with that? How do you manage to get through without making yourself sound shrill and unbalanced, and without saying things that really are not as important as you're making them and giving bad arguments? So I would have to leave that open in terms of the individual situation, and maybe different in what you're willing to say to one group or to another group. Overall, I think you're implying that I hold that often interventionism is more dangerous than standing back. I think that is true, by and large. And something of that notion that Suzanne spoke about so much, of the civil sphere, of areas that are not about government and are not about the individual either. The school, the church, the business association, where people do interact with each other without the kind of pressures that exist in politics with a capital P. If those centers of sociability or of social life are lost, then we have a much greater problem we would otherwise have. And we have to foster those areas as a kind of neutral zone where certain things can be worked out.
Thanks.
I think Hegel put so much emphasis on state, but if you read Hegel's philosophy of right, there's a lot of space devoted to civil society, which to him is lower than the political, but it's part of his philosophy as well. It has a place.
You know?
It's, I think, a very important place, right? It's the place between, you know, what we might say is Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft, right? I think it's something that we can understand, that there are concentric circles of community, right? That and it's important to keep that notion, to me, it's important to keep that notion alive. We have family, we have community, we have civil society, we have society at large, and we need to learn to have different ways of speaking, feeling in different places.
Now with that, Amazing conversation. I want to thank Suzanne Stone and Shalom Carmy for joining us in this edition of YU Voices, Crisis and Hope. Crisis and Hope, once again, is a project of the YU Center for Israel Studies, the Rabbi Arthur Schneier Program for International Affairs, and our umbrella of everything Judaic Studies at YU. Please join us next time when our topic will be Past, Present, Policy, Why Context is Crucial for Democracy, with Professor Douglas R. Burgess, Professor Joseph E. Luders, and Ms. Meira C. Shedlow. That's going to take place on Wednesday, October 28th at 5:30 p.m. Eastern. As we move into election season, let's be kind to one another. This is YU Voices. Shalom from Yeshiva University. Thank you.
Thank you.
Nice to see you all.
Thank you, everybody.
You.
Hi, Mommy.